everyone, it's Monday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. The site of a nuclear disaster that is still at the epicenter of a contentious issue. In March 2011, a 9.0 magnitude earthquake that struck Japan's eastern coast triggered a major tsunami. This sparked a major disaster, a nuclear meltdown, as the wave caused the nuclear fuel in 3 of the reactors to overheat and melt down. As a result, Japan had been storing about 1.3 million tons of treated water in approximately 1,000 tanks. But now it has begun discharging radioactive water after a treatment process, though many are still not 100% sure if it is going to be safe. What are the details of Japan's plan and how are other countries reacting to this? For this, we invite Jake Adelstein, a Tokyo-based journalist from Daily Beast. He is also the author of Tokyo Vice. Welcome, Jake.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being with us. And we also have Dr. Che Mi, research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Good to see you, Dr. Che.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you. Now, first question to our Jake. So, Japan eventually initiated the discharge of contaminated water last Thursday, and this process is expected to span more than 3 decades. Could you first give us the details of Tokyo's discharge plan?
Well, I mean, the problem is that, we had the disaster, and despite what actually many people believe that the tsunami is what caused the disaster, the first reactor was so old that the earthquake shattered all the pipes and the meltdown began in reactor 1 with just the earthquake. So even if there hadn't been a tsunami, we still would have had a meltdown. While Japan said that they were going to take care of this problem, and if you famously remember, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said when Japan was competing for the 2020 Olympics that Fukushima was under control, it was never under control because the nuclear disaster is still happening. If they don't pump water into the nuclear core, then Japan has another explosion, more nuclear materials being released into the environment. They're going to have to keep pumping water into there for 30 years. So even when they've emptied out all the vessels that have been storing water in for years while they tried to figure out what to do about this problem, they're going to have to keep pumping water into the core. If they don't pump water into the core, you might have a nuclear fission, you might have another atomic explosion, you might have even more radioactivity, and the whole thing might go out under control. So keep that in mind. It's not just about getting rid of the water that's already stored. It's about getting rid of all the water that they're going to have to pump into the nuclear core because they haven't taken out the radioactive materials. Fukushima is a nuclear accident that is still happening. And so there is no plan. When they tell you that there's a plan, when they tell you that in 30 years that they'll be done, or that in 2 years they'll be rid of all the water that's being stored on site, they're not being honest. But what do you expect from TEPCO, which has lied to the Japanese public for decades and decades, and even lied about the fact that there was no meltdown until the IEA finally showed up.
Right, I see your point. But Jake, how are Japanese people reacting to this? I mean, how are they seeing this decision? Well,
the majority of the Japanese people are not happy about this. There's a saying in Japanese, "Hyaku ga yari, ichiri nashi," meaning there's 100 things wrong. There's not one good thing about it. What is good about pumping radioactive water into the ocean? There's nothing good. It's not bad. It's not good for the environment. It's not good for Japan's reputation. It's not good for the farmers. There was even a promise by the Japanese government in 2018 that they would not do this unless they got the consensus and understanding of all the local fishermen, which they did not get, and then went ahead and did it anyway. So the typical Japanese reaction, and that's not referring to the very state-controlled media here, is disapproval, and they're upset about it. But they also feel like there's nothing else that can be done because, the Japanese government is telling them that, we have tritium under control. They're not mentioning the other 11 dangerous nuclear particles that are in that water. And they're not, discussing the fact that there are other alternatives. Dumping the water in the ocean has never been the best alternative. It's just the cheapest. And that's great for TEPCO, and that's great for the Japanese politicians in the Liberal Democratic Party who own stock in TEPCO. That's good for them. Is that good for the world or for the Japanese fishermen? Obviously not.
Right, so many are still upset about it. And however, the Japanese government is still going on with the plan, with the discharge plan. And Japan reportedly has allocated 80 billion yen to cope with any damage and help fishermen carry on with their businesses. Could you give us details of this compensation plan? And do you believe such plan will be able to appease local fishermen and those related to the seafood industry?
No, it's. I'm going to show you this because here's a little chart in Japanese. This isn't going to help you very much. But basically in 2021, the Japanese government put down 30 billion yen to expand the distribution of marine products from Fukushima to other places, to buy frozen fish that the Japanese fishermen there can't sell once they start doing this, to have publicity to convince the world that Fukushima sea products are safe. The latest 50 billion yen that has been added to that pool is supposed to help fishermen buy new fishing equipment, help them defray the cost of fuel, help them have equipment that consumes less energy. All of these things together are supposed to help the fishermen, but nothing is going to solve the problem that people are uncomfortable eating fish from water where people are dumping radioactive materials.
Right, I see your point. Now, we have been talking about how Japanese feel about this plan, but now let's go over to other countries' responses. And before that, Dr. Che, let's talk about the timing of such a discharge. Is there any reason for Japan's decision to release the wastewater soon after the Camp David Trilateral Summit?
Well, I'm not sure, but according to the Japanese media reports, there was a consideration for the South Korean government. Initially, the Japanese government had considered a mid-August the release, but the releasing before Camp David could have put the President Yoon in a difficult positions. So another article reported the same reason why the Fukushima issue was not on the agenda for the Korea-Japan summit meetings at the Camp David. Well, whether this is true or not, I think the releasing contaminated water before Camp David is have overshadowed everything else on the agenda. Also, Japanese media reported with the South Korean government facing as a very significant domestic opposition to Japan's release of the contaminated water from Fukushima. So it would be very difficult for South Korean government not to raise the issues when they meet at the Camp David after the release. So I think that maybe from Japanese side, the political consideration were also taken into account. The another reason was the trawling fishing starts on September 1st in Fukushima, so they wanted to take a week to measure before then. So I'm not sure which one is right, but maybe there should be, as I said, there was political considerations for Japanese government. Of course, there is the considerations to Korean government.
Right, I see. So political consideration taken into account. Now, Jake, Washington has been showing support to Japan. However, China, on the other hand, is showing a strong opposition and dissatisfaction. And once the biggest buyer of seafood from Japan, China on Thursday said that it would block all such imports. Could you give us more details on China's reaction?
I mean, China's reaction has been that this is polluting everyone's water, and it's given them a great chance to portray Japan as a terrible villain and a polluter of the oceans. When others have pointed out that China's own nuclear power plants are dumping tons of radiated water into the ocean with relatively high levels of tritium, I don't think that's gone over very well. But as something that no one agrees is good, China has seized this opportunity to put some pressure on Japan and give the Chinese people an enemy to dislike. That's always a very good Chinese government tactic for uniting people. And at the same time, the Japanese government and the Japanese media is now focusing on China's overreaction, and that a few Chinese citizens have been making phone calls to Japan and complaining about the fuel dumping, and that has become big news. Suddenly the Japanese media has decided, let's not focus on the actual problem of us dumping radioactive materials into the water. Let's focus on the Chinese people. A couple, or several, are calling Japanese TV stations and restaurants in Fukushima and complaining about the dumping of water. So for both sides, this has become a sort of propaganda model. China is using Japan's dumping as something to beat upon Japan and, I don't know, maybe use it for leverage in some kind of trade talks. And Japan is using the China issue to distract the people from the real problems present. Overwhelmingly, within about 3 or 4 days, the coverage in Japanese media has shifted from, is this water safe? How do the people feel, to China is making a big deal about this, and Chinese people are harassing Japanese fishermen and Fukushima.
All right, I can see how two sides are both using each other for their own political reason. Now, Dr. Che, Tokyo's relationship with Beijing had already deteriorated in recent years as it drew closer to the U.S., and it seems Sino-Japanese ties is further being damaged. What impact does this event have on the two countries' ties and, of course, on public sentiment?
Yeah, China has already banned the import of Japanese seafood, and also the boycott of Japanese goods are spreading in China, and tourist arrivals to Japan are declining. So the embassy of Japan in China has issued the guideline for visitors, such as not speaking loudly in Japanese outside and not taking photos of anti-Japanese protests. So these behaviors are likely to stir up the antipathy toward the other country and lead to a reduction to the people-to-people exchanges. And as of today, a visit to China by the representative of Komeito in Japan versus in coalition party with the LDP has been postponed. I guess China-Japan conflict will last for some time. However, China's ban on Japanese seafood imports could be economically devastating for Japan, especially in Fukushima area. So it is expected that Japan will make efforts to resolve these issues. And I guess there will be the high-level meeting between China and Japan on the occasion of multilateral conference next month.
Right, I see. Dr. Che, one more question. I'd like to now focus on North Korea. So during the recent UNSC meeting to discuss Pyongyang's latest satellite launch, the regime's ambassador to the UN condemned Japan, saying the release is a heinous crime against mankind and the environment. Is it safe to say the regime's criticism is to redirect the world's attention from the regime to Tokyo?
Yeah, I was surprised when the North Korea mentioned about the Fukushima issues on UNSC meetings. The North Korea's comments were in a situation where there was no context at all. The North Korea has continued to argue that it possesses the nuclear weapons and the launching missiles for their own safety, and then they refer to Japan's Fukushima contaminated water problems. I'm not a North Korean researcher, so I'm not sure the exact intention of North Korea, but it can be seen that they are trying to distract attention from North Korea through these issues. And also, they shows their positions. It means that they have same side with China.
Right, I see. Dr. Che, let's also focus on Seoul as well. So Seoul and Tokyo agreed that the Japanese government will provide Korea with real-time data, and Korean experts would be allowed to make regular visits to the IAEA field office in Fukushima for monitoring. Some, however, say that such an agreement is less than what South Korea originally expected. What's your view on this? And given that thousands of people have rallied in Seoul over the weekend, protesting to Japan's decision, could such a strong opposition lead to the effect deterioration in Seoul-Tokyo ties?
Well, about the regular visit to IAEA from the Korean side, I thought at the first time that it seems like the Koreans' request was not accepted by Japanese side and IAEA. But I think it's not. And then I thought that it's not about the result because there are advantages to having a local presence, I mean, residence in Japan. And of course, there's advantages, but it's very hard not to be influenced by local voices. So I think we will be able to accurately identify Koreans' concern and conduct objective activities based on those voices. And in addition, experts with different perspectives will be able to participate in the regular visit. So I would like to analyze it positively as an opportunity to broaden the scope of Korean science activities. And also about the Korea-Japan relations. Of course, there are a lot of concern and opposition about these issues in South Korea. But the South Korean government at least is not dealing with it, diplomatic issues. Of course, it's not a diplomatic issue as well. But anyway, the South Korean government has been consistent in saying that it is based on scientific evidence. And if the Japanese government is transparent in its disclosure of information, and they will not break their promise and commitments, I think the Korean government will not take these issues as diplomatic issues. However, I think the South Korean government needs to do a better job of communicating with the South Korean people's concern to Japan. If it doesn't, the South Koreans maybe the negative feeling and frustration towards the South Korean government will get growing and growing, and it could make South Korea's policy towards Japan more difficult.
I see your point. Now, up until now, we have been talking about other countries' reactions, but the biggest concern of the discharge was the level of radioactive isotope tritium. And so, Jake, as far as I know, Japan's not only fisheries agency, but also the environment ministry have done tests, and they got the results. How were they?
The results were that it was, way below the levels of danger, right? And that's sort of to be expected. They've had a long time to dilute the tritium and things. One of the problems is, of course, we know that the Japanese government and TEPCO has lied about how bad things were at the nuclear power plant many, many times over the years. So they have a credibility issue. If they let, like a Korean scientist, come in and sample the water independently, take it back to Korea and do their own test, maybe people would be more inclined to believe that those are the results. But the other thing that is extremely dishonest about the way that Japan is doing this is that there are many other radioactive materials in this water that they're not measuring or putting the results out or taking into account. And those include 3 isotopes. There's iodine, there's cesium-135, there's cesium-137. All of these are things that when they get into the food chain and get into the human body can do tremendous damage to marine life and people. Those figures, they're not necessarily publicizing, and they're not very transparent. And so everybody's saying tritium, but the scientists who are actually looking at this are going, actually, there are other things in this water that you really need to look at. And the other thing is that I don't think people realize it, but a small number of people in Japan do realize is that this isn't water from your basic nuclear power plant. This is water that's been pumped into a nuclear disaster that's contaminated by many things by this basically nuclear accident out of control. So it isn't as filtered, it isn't as pure as what you would get from a nuclear power plant that's running normally. And that's part of the problem. The figures that the Japanese government announced aren't necessarily trusted. They probably should be. But things are so bad in this country that in 2019, a poll of the Japanese people done by Nikkei Shimbun found that 89% of the Japanese people do not believe Japanese government statistics. And when 89% of the people here don't believe Japanese government statistics and data, it's not a surprise that the rest of the world is skeptical.
I see your point, and I also see how your point that we should also consider many other radioactive isotopes as well. Now, Jake, what is also concerning is that not even Japan knows when this will be completed, as rainwater and groundwater keep coming into contact with radioactive debris, generating new wastewater every day. I think you have already mentioned this. Does Japan also have such concerns?
Yes, Japan has concerns, but they are not being voiced loudly and they're not being heard. Remember, as I told you at the beginning of this program, every day Japan has to pump water into that core. Once it stops pumping, we have another disaster. And that's not going to stop for 20, 30 years. So it's not about the water that's being stored and getting rid of that. We're going to have more and more water. This cycle will continue for a very long time.
Right, I see. Well, Dr. Che, we are running out of time, but I'd like to ask you this last question. The release of this wastewater just started, but it seems this issue is going to be controversial for a long time. How should Japan deal with this issue to keep the environment safe and not to sour diplomatic ties with neighboring countries?
I would like to emphasize two things. First one is responsibility, and second one is transparency. No one wants to nuclear accident at the time, and even in Japan. But since it happened in Japan, Japan must take a responsibility for it. So Japan should continue explain and disclosure transparent information based on scientific evidence to relieve concerns. So many people are concerned about it, and it's very natural things. But Japan needs to make an effort to release people's concern.
Right, I see. I hope Japan keeps in mind that responsibility and transparency are the key things to keep in mind. All right, well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Jake and Dr. Che, for your time and insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.